Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is on the federal bureaucracy. Okay, so extra credit if you can spell it correct. Not really. But you should know what the bureaucracy is because it comes up on exams all the time. And it's one of those areas of an exam that AP kids across the country typically struggle at. So if you can do moderately well to really well on this topic, you are making up a lot of ground and passing people up towards your 4 or 5 on the exam. So first off, when you see the phrase bureaucracy, do not panic. The federal bureaucracy has a simple definition. Are government organizations staffed with officials selected on the basis of their experience and their expertise, all right? Their job, the bureaucracy's job, is to implement and to execute policy for the government itself, mainly through the executive branch. All right, the textbook begins, and I'm going to give you a few examples throughout. The chapter begins with a discussion on FEMA. That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency for the government. Their job is to assist the president in assisting Americans as we go through disasters like hurricanes and flooding. The FEMA will come in to assist local officials, residents dealing with tragic circumstances. And so it's just one example of a variety of different ways that the government tries to help people and execute the law, all right? And sometimes it's through assistance or regulation. All right, recognizing or thinking about the bureaucracy, you have to recognize that there's over 3 million employees of the federal government, all right? And so many of these individuals are placed there by the president, but the vast majority of them are employees, civil service employees, and we'll get into that more later, all right? Their existence, and the reason if it's grown dramatically, but their existence is based upon Article 2 itself, all right? And in Article 2, they mention that there shall be some executive departments that are there to assist the president in part in the execution of the law. So there's a constitutional basis for the existence of these individuals. It began to become more formal as George Washington established his cabinet when he took office, and those executive departments took on a more concrete or well-defined structure. The initial cabinet departments were the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the Department of War, which was unfortunately later named the Department of Defense. In addition to that, in the cabinet, George Washington put his Attorney General, all right, as a legal advisor to the President of the United States. That Attorney General has turned into the lead or the head of the Justice Department under our cabinet. Further presidents came along and made some changes to the use of the organization, the bureaucratic organization. One of those is remembered the most is President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson used what is referred to as political patronage to staff these different bureaucratic agencies, and patronage, of course, is returning individual support, could be donations, returning favors to individuals, all right, by giving them positions within the government. And so political patronage became the way many of these positions were filled for a significant period of time. That changed in large part with the passage of the Pendleton Act in 1883. The Pendleton Act was meant to create a more merit-based system, right, in which government employees earn their job through testing, through accurate measurement of their true qualifications and expertise. All right, that becomes the basis for their hiring. Over 90% of all the employees within our federal government, they're hired based upon this merit-based system rather than appointees of a president. All right, they're merit-based, and they might serve in there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. This could be their entire career. The modern bureaucracy has grown significantly. Much of that, again, through the growth of the power of the federal government itself relative to the states, like we talked about when we talked about federalism. The president himself currently appoints over 6,500 employees every time he takes office. 6,500 members of the bureaucracy are appointed by the president. About a third of those not only require the president's appointment, but also then the confirmation from the United States Senate. All right. Again, so we're talking millions more, all right? Most of those 3 million are merit-based, civil service employees. When we think about the structure, we visualize the structure of the bureaucracy as a pyramid with those appointees from the president, the secretaries of the cabinet, the attorney general as the head of the top of the pyramid. Below those individuals, there are what they refer to as senior executive service individuals. Those are persons that fall below some of the undersecretaries, but they have more significant powers as civil service employees. The vast majority of members are referred to as simply general service, or they serve in GS levels. And as you make your way through, right, you're kind of graded out with your GS level. As your GS level changes, you make more money, and that comes with experience in large part. Okay. The bureaucracy is oftentimes impacted, or itself impacts, our policymaking process itself. One of the things that the bureaucracy is the largest part of when we look at our policymaking system itself are what is referred to as iron triangles. And we'll see this a couple times in the textbook. This is the first time it's come up. An iron triangle refers to three different sides of this policymaking process, three different groups that really work to help each other. Among those three groups, in addition to the federal bureaucracy itself and some of these different agencies, you've got the United States Congress, and you have interest groups. And the idea of iron triangles is that these different interest groups, Congress and bureaucracy, that as a triangle itself, that the sides strengthen each other, that they work to protect the interest of each other, they work to assist each other. So whether it's interest groups helping members of Congress getting elected, and members of Congress helping the bureaucracy by increasing their budget, those different iron triangles increase their power in regards and influence in regards to policymaking. Over the last 30 or so years, there have been more growth in interest groups, or an explosion of interest groups. And with that, instead of just iron triangles, we look at also what are referred to as issue networks. Issue networks are any kind of issue that might be created within our society for a short period of time or not. And these issue networks are finding ways to connect these different interest groups to policymakers, policy advocates, to push that policy through the system as quickly as they can. Some of these will be temporary. The issue networks are much more fluid than the iron triangles and a lot less structured, but the issue networks nonetheless are influential in policymaking. As a member of the bureaucracy, really what you do is you're making policy itself. That policy oftentimes originates with the laws that were passed by Congress. And so Congress might pass a law which encourages the environment to be cleaned up, right? It's up to the bureaucracy to implement these laws. And so implementation is a large part of what most bureaucracies do. And through that, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll notice in congressional laws that the law is very generalized, and there aren't specifics in there that tell them how it's supposed to be enacted, enforced, etc. So that leads to what's referred to as bureaucratic discretion. And so it's up to the bureaucracy to decide, how do we actually achieve these goals that the various laws that have been created by Congress set out. And so through that, what you do with your bureaucratic discretion is you come up with regulations. Regulations are these rules that businesses, different political institutions have to follow, individuals, right? And so as the bureaucracy has grown, so has the number of regulations. Today, you can look in the Federal Register and you can find over 70,000 pages worth of bureaucratic regulations that one group or many groups or others have to follow as part of this implementation process. There are more than 100 regulatory agencies, in other words, groups that have power to regulate some element of our society, our economy, regulate you as an individual. Besides FEMA, like I mentioned earlier, a few of the other groups that you probably should know are the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. They keep an eye and they regulate the electoral process for federal government officials, whether it's legislative or executive, their rules, they enforce those rules. The Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, regulates the markets. The EPA is a group that you should think of when you think of the bureaucracy, Environmental Protection Agency. They protect our environment, and so it's up to them to come up with regulations to do that. And the FCC is probably another group that you've heard of before, the Federal Communication Commissions. They regulate the airwaves, whether it's radio and TV, and keep track of what's going on there. Those members of the EPA, the SEC, like all federal employees, they are in theory restricted by the Hatch Act, which restricts federal employees from engaging in political activity. And in part, that was meant to protect federal employees so government officials couldn't force them to work for their campaigns, to push for their re-election. But in times, it also restricts them expressing their own individual preferences. There have been some minor changes to the Hatch Act since the 1990s that give people a little more individual freedom, but it still remains a general purpose of the idea of the Hatch Act is to keep federal employees, to make them more nonpartisan in their jobs, and sometimes that affects their personal lives. As a last point for the bureaucracy and for this chapter, recognizing that these bureaucratic agencies are limited by the different branches of government is a simple way to kind of recognize that there's a checks and balance system here also. And so we think about each branch and how they restrict the bureaucracy. So we could start with the president. The president, through his power of appointment, of course, influences the bureaucracy. But he also can influence their direction through the issuing of executive orders. By issuing executive orders, you're giving a clear statement to some of these various departments on exactly what you want them to do, and that's how the president influences things. Congress influences the bureaucracy through a couple different ways. Number one, they control the budgets of all these bureaucratic agencies, so those dollars play a significant role in influencing what those departments can or cannot do. They also use oversight, and they use the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office, to keep an eye on these different bureaucratic agencies to ensure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, spending the money properly, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, the judicial branch, all right, is in charge of making sure that the bureaucracy is not going too far. There have been times where they step in, like when they tell the EPA that their regulations or their discretion in those regulations implementation, that it's going too far, and they can push the bureaucracy back a little bit. So that's chapter 7. We'll see you tomorrow for the quiz.